After 1,000 years had passed in the third age of sun, an elven ship came out of the western sea and sailed to the Grey Havens. Upon that ship were 5 aged men with long white beards and great cloaks. Each cloak was a different color, and each man wore a tall pointed hat, high black traveler's boots, and carried a long staff. These were the Istari, whom men called wizards. Their hats and staffs were their signs of office. They were an order and a brotherhood sent to Middle-earth from the Undying Lands, for it was perceived by the great powers of Arda that a great evil was growing in mortal lands. Though the Istari came secretly and in humble form, in the beginning, before their arrival in Middle-earth, they were mighty spirits. They were Maiar, spirits older than the world itself, and of that first race that came from the mind of Iluvatar in the timeless halls. Yet in the diminished world of Middle-earth in the Third Age, they were forbidden to come forth in power as Maiar. They were limited to the form of men and the powers that might be found within the mortal world. Although 5 Istari are said to have come to Middle-earth, only 3 are named in the histories that have come to men, for the others were said to have gone to the east, and they played no part in the fate of the Westlands. First named and most praised in the Fourth Age was Gandalf the Grey, whom by the elves was called Mithrandir, by the dwarves Tharkun, and Incanus by the Haradrim. As a Maya in the Undying Lands, he was named Olorin, and was accounted wisest of his people. At that time he resided in the gardens of Lorien, the master of visions and dreams, and also went often to the house of Nienna the Weeper. Tutored by the Vala Lorien in the gardens, Olorin's wisdom for many ages grew greater still. Also, counseled by Nienna in her house, which looks out on the walls of night, to his wisdom was added pity and endurance beyond hope. Of all the Istari, Gandalf is counted the greatest, for by his wisdom the free peoples of Middle-earth were guided to victory over the Dark Lord Sauron, who wished to enslave them. In this Gandalf was aided by Narya, the elven ring of fire, that Círdan, Lord of the Grey Havens, gave him, for Narya had power to make men brave and resolute. By Gandalf's instigation, Smaug the dragon was slain, and the battles of 5 armies, the Hornburg, and Pelennor fields were won. By Gandalf's hand alone, the Balrog of Moria was destroyed. Yet his greatest deed of all was his discovery of the One Ring, and his guiding of the ring-bearer to the place of his destruction. By this action the ring was unmade, and Sauron and all his servants and all his kingdoms were brought to utter ruin. Gandalf's task upon Middle-earth was completed by this one act, and so the Third Age ended with Gandalf's departure to the Undying Lands. Second named of the Istari is Radagast the Brown, who lived in Raskabel in the Vales of Anduin. Radagast played a part in the White Council, which was formed to stand against Sauron, but it seems his greatest concern was with the Kelvar and Olvar of Middle-earth, and little is told of him in the chronicles of that time. He was wiser than any man in all things concerning herbs and beasts. It is said he spoke the many tongues of birds. Even the Beorings and woodsmen of Mirkwood, and the mighty and guardians of the forests of Fangorn spoke with reverence of the wisdom of Radagast the Brown, for in forest lore he had no equal. Last named of this story is Saruman the White, whom elves called Curanir, man of skill. When the Istari were formed, Saruman was counted the greatest of the order. For many centuries Saruman wandered the lands of Middle-earth, and eagerly sought to destroy Sauron the Dark Lord, but after a time he grew proud and desired power for himself. In the year 2759, Saruman came to Isengard, and Beren, the ruling steward of Gondor, granted him the key to the Tower of Orthanc, for it was thought this story would aid the men of Gondor and the Rohirrim in war against the Orcs, Easterlings, and Dunlendings. However, Saruman made a mighty place of evil power there, and summoned Orc legions and Uruk-hai, half-orcs, and Dunlendings to him. In Isengard he flew the standard of his tyranny, the black banner marked with a ghostly white hand. In his pride he grew foolish, until he was ensnared by Sauron, who commanded sorcery far greater than his own. So the greatest of the Istari, who had come to destroy the Dark Lord, became one of his agents. Yet Saruman's power was annihilated by the wrath of the Ents, the valor of the Rohirrim and Hurons, and the wisdom of Gandalf. Isengard was destroyed by the Ents. His army was exterminated by the Rohirrim and the Hurons, and his staff was broken and his sorcerer's power was taken by Gandalf. So low did Saruman fall that in his defeat he looked for petty vengeance in the tiny realm of the Shire, where the hobbits, the least of his enemies, resided. Here, in a pathetic bid for domination, Saruman was bested by the hobbits and slain by his own servant, Grima Wormtongue. When Saruman died, his body shriveled to a form without flesh. It swiftly became skin, skull, and bones wrapped in a ragged cloak, and from it rose a grey mist in a column. For a moment, it is said, this grey form of Saruman's Maiar spirit stood over his mortal remains, but a wind came and it vanished. In a great hall under the mountains of Middle-earth, Aiuli, the smith of the Valar, fashioned the seven fathers of dwarves during the ages of darkness, when Melkor and his evil servants in Utummo and Angband held sway over all Middle-earth. Therefore, Aiuli made dwarves stout and strong, unaffected by cold and fire, and sturdier than the races that followed. Aiuli knew of the great evil of Melkor, so he made the dwarves stubborn, indomitable, and persistent in labor and hardship. They were brave in battle, and their pride and will could not be broken. The dwarves were deep-delving miners, masons, metalworkers, and the most wondrous stone carvers. They were well suited to the crafts of Aiuli, who had shaped the mountains, for they were made strong, long-bearded, and tough, but not tall, being 4 to 5 feet in height. As their toil was long, they were each granted a life of about 2.5 centuries, for they were mortal. They could also be slain in battle. Aiuli made the dwarves wise with the knowledge of his crafts, and gave them a language of their own called Kuzdul. In this tongue, Aiuli was called Mahal, and the dwarves Khazad. But it was a secret tongue unknown for but a few words to all but dwarves, who guarded it jealously. The dwarves also gave thanks to Aiuli, and acknowledged that by him they were given shape, yet they were given true life by Iluvatar. It is said that once Aiuli had made the dwarves, he secretly hid them from the other Valar, and thought himself and them hidden as well from Iluvatar. Yet Iluvatar was aware of Aiuli's deed, and judged that Aiuli's act was done without malice, and thus he sanctified the dwarves. Yet he would not permit that this race should come forth before his chosen children, the elves, who were to be the firstborn. So, though the dwarves were fully wrought, Aiuli took them and laid them deeply under stone, and in this darkness the seven fathers of dwarves slept for many ages before the stars were rekindled and the time of awakening drew near. So it was that the elves awoke and Cuivianen in the east in the first age of stars. In the years that followed, the seven fathers of dwarves stirred, and their stone chamber was broken open, and they arose and were filled with awe. It is said that each of these seven fathers made a great mansion under the mountains of Middle-earth, but the elven histories of those early years speak only of 3. These were the dwarf realms called Belegost and Nogrod in the Blue Mountains, and Khazad-dûm in the Misty Mountains. The tale of Khazad-dûm is longest, for this was the house of the first father called King Durin the First, and Durin the Deathless. To the elves of Beleriand in the Age of Stars, the dwarves of Belegost and Nogrod were a boon indeed, for they came into the realm of the Grey Elves with weapons and tools of steel, and displayed great skill in the working of stone. And though the Grey Elves had not previously known of these people, whom they thought unloving, calling them the Nogrim, the stunted people, they soon understood the dwarves were wise in the crafts of Aiuli, and so they also called them the Gonhirim, masters of stone. There was much trade between the elves and dwarves, and both peoples prospered. And though an ungainly people without graceful form, the dwarves brought forth much beauty. Their mansions had grand halls filled with bright banners, armor, jeweled weapons, and fine tapestries. Starlight shone down great light wells and played upon mirroring pools and sparkling silver fountains. In echoing domes, by the light of crystal lamps, bright gemstones and veins of precious ores might be seen. And walls of jet polished like glass, dreaming marble forms were visible, and winding stair or twisting avenue might lead to tall, fair tower or court of many-colored stone. Tunnels led to courtyards and grottos with columns of alabaster, fluted by time and the gentle prompting of dwarf chisels. In the ages of starlight, the dwarves of the Blue Mountains fashioned the finest steel that the world had ever seen. In Belegost, which is also called Gabelgathal and Mikkelberg, the famous dwarf mail of rings was first made, while in Nogrod, which is called Tumunzahal and Hollowbald, resided Telkar, the greatest dwarf smith of all time. At this time, these dwarves forged the weapons of the Sindar and built for the great elves of King Thingol their citadel of Menegroth, the Thousand Caves, reputed to be the fairest of mansions on Middle-earth. The War of the Jewels came in the First Age of Sun, and in it most of the dwarves fought with the elves against the servants of Morgoth. Of all dwarves of that age, greatest fame was won by King Azaghal, the Lord of Belagost. In the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, only the dwarves could withstand the blaze of dragonfire, for they were a race of smiths used to great heat, and on their helms they wore masks of steel that protected their faces from flames. Thus the dwarves of Belagost could stop the advance of the dragon horde, and though slain in the act, King Azaghal drove his sword into the belly of Glaurung, the father of dragons, and so Glaurung and his brood fled from the battlefield. Not all the deeds of the dwarves in that age were praiseworthy, for it is told, the dwarves of Nogrod desired the Silmaril, and for it they murdered King Thingol and sacked the citadel of Menegroth. In turn, the dwarves were caught by the Lake Quendi at the ford of Gelion, and the Silmaril was taken from them, and those who escaped the ambush were attacked by Ents and utterly destroyed. From the ending of the First Age of Sun, the histories of elves and men that speak of dwarves tell primarily of those of Durin's line, who lived in Khazad-dûm. When the destruction of Beleriand came with the War of Wrath, the mansions of Nogrod and Belagost were broken and lost. The dwarves of those kingdoms came into the Misty Mountains in the Second Age and made Khazad-dûm, that greatest mansion of dwarves on Middle-earth, greater still. The vast halls filled with these prosperous people, whose craftsmen achieved matchless deeds, and whose miners delved deep and long into the mountain's heart. In the Second Age, many of the Noldoran elves of Lindon entered into a region near the west shore of Khazad-dûm, and made a kingdom so they might trade with the dwarves for the precious metal mithril, which is found in abundance there. These elves were the Gwathi Myrdain, who were called the Elven Smiths in later times. By the wisdom of these elves and Sauron's deceit, the rings of power were forged in this place. And though dwarves were given 7 of these rings, they were not drawn into the terrible wars that followed for all the years that remained in the Second Age. In Khazad-dûm, the dwarves closed the doors of their mansions to the troubles of the world. None could force an entry into their realm, but ever after it was thought to be a closed and dark kingdom, and so Khazad-dûm was renamed Moria. Thus the dwarves of Durin's line survived into the Third Age of Sun, though by then they had seen their greatest days, and the dwarvish people had begun to dwindle. Yet Moria stood for 5 ages of stars and 3 of sun, and until the 20th century of the Third Age was still wealthy and proud. But in the year 1980, when Durin VI was king, the delving dwarves quarried too deep beneath the mountains, because they released a great demon. This was one of Morgoth's Balrogs, and it came in wrath and slew King Durin and his son Nain, and drove the dwarves of Moria out forever. Durin's people were made a homeless, wandering folk, but in the year 1999, Nain's son Thrain founded the kingdom under the mountain in Erebor. For a while, Thrain and some of the people of Moria prospered, for Erebor, the lonely mountain, was rich in ore and stones. But Thrain's son Thorin left that place and in the year 2210 went to the Grey Mountains, where it was said the greatest numbers of the scattered dwarves of Moria already lived. Here, Thorin was accepted as king, and with his ring of power, his people grew wealthy again. After Thorin, his son Groin ruled, then Oin, and Nain II, and the Grey Mountains became famed for dwarf gold. And so, during the reign of Nain II's son Dain, out of the northern wastes there came many cold drakes of the deserts. Lusting for the wealth of the dwarves, these dragons came prepared for war, and they slew the dwarves and drove them out of the Grey Mountains. In the year 2590, the heir of Dain I, Thror, took part of the survivors of the Grey Mountains realm back to the kingdom under the mountain in Erebor, while in the same year his brother Gror took those others who remained to the Iron Hills. And again for a time all these people prospered, for there was great trade between dwarves, men of Dale and Esgaroth, and the elves of Mirkwood. Yet for Durin's folk the peace was short-lived, for in 2770, during the long reign of Thror, the greatest dragon of the Third Age, the winged fire drake called Smaug the Golden, came to Erebor. None could stand before this great dragon. He slew wantonly, sacked Dale, and drove the dwarves from the mountain. There for 2 centuries Smaug remained, lord of the lonely mountain. So again the dwarves were driven from their homes. Some retreated into the Iron Hills colony for shelter, but other survivors followed King Thror and his son Thrain II and grandson Thorin II in wandering companies. In this period, Thor was slain by orcs of Moria, and his body was mutilated, and his severed head was delivered to his people. The dwarves, who had already suffered grievously from various evil hands, felt they could not bear this last insult. All the houses of dwarves gathered together, and they decided to wage a great war. This was the terrible and bloody War of the Dwarves and Orcs. It raged for 7 long years, and through all the Westlands the dwarf army hunted out every orc cavern and slew every orc band, until at last it reached Moria's east gate in the year 2799. Here was fought the Battle of Azanulbizar, which is famous even in the histories of the elves. In that battle, the orcs of the north were all but exterminated by the dwarves. Yet the dwarves had little joy in their victory, for half of all their warriors perished in that war. Such a loss could never be regained by this already dwindling folk. Even in spoils and territory they gained little from this war, for though the orcs were slain, the Balrogs still held Moria, and dragons occupied the kingdom under the mountain in Erebor, and the dwarf realms of the Grey Mountains. The dwarves retreated to their kingdoms filled with sadness. The grandson of Gror, Dane Ironfoot, returned to rule in the Iron Hills, while Thrain II with his son Thorin II, now called Oakenshield, went west to the Blue Mountains and made a humble kingdom there. Yet Thrain II did not rule long, because while traveling he was captured by Sauron near Mirkwood and imprisoned in Dol Guldur. The last ring of the dwarves was taken from him, and he was tortured to death. Yet Thorin Oakenshield remained in the Blue Mountains, for he did not know the fate of his father. Many wandering dwarves came to the Blue Mountains, and his halls grew, but he was unhappy and decided to return to Erebor, to the kingdom under the mountain, which had been his grandfather's. With such thoughts in mind, Thorin Oakenshield approached the wizard Gandalf in the year 2941, and they immediately fell to a plan of great adventure, which is told by the hobbit Bilbo Baggins in the Red Book of Westmarch. This one hobbit and 12 dwarves accompanied Thorin in his mission to regain his kingdom. The 12 were Fili, Kili, Dori, Ori, Nori, Oin, Gloin, Balin, Dwalin, Bifur, Bofor, and Bombur. As is told in the Hobbit's tale, Thorin more or less achieved his aim, for in the end the dragon Smaug the Golden was slain, and Thorin II took possession of his rightful kingdom, yet his grasp on it was brief. There followed the Battle of 5 Armies, in which orcs, wolves, and bats battled against dwarves, elves, men, and eagles, and though the orcish legions were destroyed, so too was Thorin's life ended. This was not, however, the end of Durin's line, for Dane Ironfoot had come to the Battle of 5 Armies with 500 warriors out of the Iron Hills, and he was Thorin's rightful heir, being like Thorin a great-grandson of Dane I. So Dane Ironfoot became Dane II, and he ruled wisely into the last days of the War of the Ring, when he fell with King Brand of Dale before the gates of the kingdom under the mountain. Yet this dwarf kingdom withstood the attack by Saruman's minions, and Dane's heir Thorin III, who was also called Thorin Stonehelm, ruled there long and prosperously into the 4th Age of Sun. Yet the kingdom under the mountain was not the last and only home of Durin's folk in the 4th Age. Another noble dwarf descended from Borin, brother of Dane I, had founded a kingdom of dwarves at the beginning of the 4th Age after the War of the Ring. This dwarf was Gimli, son of Gloin. He had won great fame in the war, and he had been one of the fellowship chosen for the quest of the ring. He had acquitted himself well in all tasks, and the song of his axe had been a terror to his foes at the battles of the Hornburg, Pelennor Fields, and before the Black Gate. At the war's end, Gimli had taken many of the dwarves out of the kingdom under the mountain into the wondrous caves of Helm's Deep, and by all he was named Lord of Aglarond, the Glittering Caves. For more than a century, Gimli the Elf-Friend ruled Aglarond, but after the death of King Elisar, he allowed others to govern and went to the realm of his great friend Legolas, Elf-Lord of Ithilien. Here, it is claimed, Gimli boarded an elven ship, and with his companion sailed over the great sea to the Undying Lands. This is the last that the histories of Middle-earth tell of dwarves. It is not known if their kingdom survived the 4th Age and the dominion of men. It is known they dwindled further, but whether they still live within secret caverns of the world, or have now gone to the mansions of Aiuli, cannot be learned.